thank you. Right, as I said, my name's Beccy Sawbridge. I'm going to take my glasses off while I just waffle at you for a few minutes. At this present moment in time, we have 3 of our speakers present on the Zoom. Steve Williams from Waverley, Ria Patel from Croydon, Rob Walker, who I thought was from Kirklees, but is not there now. He'll explain himself, I'm sure, when he has the opportunity. And Chris Jarvis has said that he will join in about 5 minutes. I'm hoping that this will be a hopeful and useful discussion for us all to speak about the way that councils work, and that the differences around the country can make it very difficult for our messaging when we go forward. I'm a town councillor, which means that there are 3 tiers to the councils in this area, which are a town council is basically a parish council level. Then we have the district council and Kent County Council, and we were very fortunate at the last set of elections to have an uptake of Kent County of Greens on Kent County Council. So they're doing amazing work at this moment in time and helping raise the profile of the Green Party. However, the difficulty often is that the majority of people don't always know what their councillors do and how their councillors can help them. Myself, I long before I joined the Green Party, I've been a member of the Green Party for the past decade, but our Dover and Deal Green Party was only re-established in 2015. And then in 2019, we had the breakthrough of having 3 parish councils with Greens actually in the room. And that is the important thing about it more than anything else, is that once Greens are in the room on councils, they make a difference. They make a difference to the sort of conversations that councils have in terms of what may be possible. And particularly where I am, because we're we're fairly new to council work, we're very much activists, small party with activists in Dover. Saying that, though, Dover, as you all well know, has a much higher profile in terms of what happens in Dover in the national goings on. However, most people don't always realise that Dover as an area is predominantly rural, and so that gives a different complexity to the way that locals view their councillors and what they can or what they can and can't do for them. And one of the things with the parish councils particularly is that when budgets are set, the town councils or the parish councils have to budget their budget. They have to balance their budgets, or if they're unable to do that, the district council will take over that job for them. They will take over that role.
What Israel is doing at the moment, and huge criticism.
Hello.
All right.
That's one of the things that one of the difficulties that I wanted to bring out in terms of my role and the work that I've been doing, and also to see, as you can see, I wear my Palestine solidarity badge with pride, and everyone knows that I'm an activist in that work and has been predominantly throughout my life. I am so proud of the statement that we brought out today, because it means a lot of work, and it's putting us and front foot forward in terms of the really sad way that our world is moving at this time. And I think too, it's something that I'm sure many of us have already experienced, that we have been getting a bit of opposition for it. You Greens do this, you Greens do that. I've even had the position where people have questioned me wearing my Palestine Solidarity badge and my scarf in council meetings, and whether or not I should take them off. At which point the mayor stepped in and sort of like said, no, we don't want to get into an argument with Beccy about that. I just thought I'd say that because of the work that's going on today. Our speakers are going to speak for 10 minutes each. And then after that, we'll open it up to questions. And as I said, Pete will do the organising and indicate to me who wishes to speak. So without ado, if you don't mind, Steve Williams has said that he will start off, and then if you don't mind, Ria, and then Rob Walker, and hopefully Chris will come in afterwards when he joins us. Oh, Chris is there. Lovely to see you, Chris. So you'll be last. Sorry about that. I didn't notice that. Thank you, Pete. So, Steve.
Okay, thanks ever so much. Thanks ever so much. And yeah, I'll sort of just briefly introduce myself, I guess. I'm a councillor on Waverley Borough Council in Surrey, and I'm an executive member of the council and the portfolio holder for environment and sustainability. So my own portfolio of responsibilities covers our climate plan, air quality, waste collection, green spaces and biodiversity. And like many others at the front line of addressing environmental challenges, ensuring the well-being of our community, maintaining services and doing everything possible in the current climate to tackle the cost of living crisis, I'm finding that these efforts are being suffocated, inevitably being suffocated by that tightening grip of reduced financial support from central government. And I've seen that over the past few years as a councillor, and it's been going on for many years. So it's not new. The proportion of central government support for local government has been reduced systematically from the Thatcher years onwards by Conservative and by right-wing Labour governments. And the capacity of councillors to actually raise their own finances, with the exception actually of the sort of parish council level that Beccy was referring to, is very severely restricted. And business rates, which used to be raised by local government and spent by local government, are now set by central government and now go almost entirely back to central government. So effectively, we are, I think, in a political landscape that does not value localism, does not value local democracy, and does not value public service. So emerging then from recent budget discussions, those sort of tortuous discussions that you have in local government about the budget, Waverley faces a kind of imminent threat, like so many other councils across the country, the strangulation of local government as severe cuts in local government funding begin to bite. You know, we're not one of those councils that risks a Section 114 notice and being effectively taken over, like Woking just down the road from us, or Birmingham and so on. But clearly each year we face the situation where local government makes the books balance at the last minute because, you know, we had a notion of the amount of funding that was available to us on the 18th of December. We had a notion of the amount of funding that was available for us in the 24-25 financial year, beginning in April, in December. And it wasn't until the 5th of February that the UK government officially announced its local government finance settlement for that financial year. You know, so each year we're facing this situation where local government makes the books balance each year with the medium-term financial plan looking forward to the years ahead, looking very grim indeed. And then you have another round the following year. So the idea of any kind of sensible long-term planning, you know, just goes by the board. In other words, we're lurching year after year from crisis to crisis, and the crisis in local government is getting worse. And we're effectively, I guess, facing, we effectively cover in our district council level authority two budgets. There's the main revenue account and the housing revenue account. And just to say a word or two about the housing revenue account, that exists basically as a separate account to stop councils from funding social housing from the general fund. We are not allowed to do that. There's a kind of iron wall that separates our main revenue fund from our social housing fund. So let's look at this beast, the housing revenue account. It has to balance, so we can't kind of, you know, spend to invest. And so the maintenance of what is for us an aging council housing stock must be done at the expense of raising rents. So, you know, you're in that kind of no-win scenario. Any new build social housing, and we are in Waverley building as many new passive house standard council homes as we can, and we, you know, we have been adding to our stock, but all that has to be paid out of the housing revenue account. But of course, there's another twist to that, because Waverley, as one of the councils with its own social housing stock, did not hand over its social housing stock to a housing association at the time when the government was seeking to completely outsource, privatise rented housing. So effectively, Waverley took out an £850 million mortgage on its own housing stock. So it's got to pay back interest on the value of its own housing stock year after year after year. And so that already bites into the social, into the housing revenue account and has to be paid for out of council rents. So, you know, that actually acts as a significant barrier in terms of us actually expanding as much as we'd like our social housing stock. So, you know, and even the County Councils Association recently issued a warning that councils are running out of road to prevent financial insolvency, with overspends contributing to a total projected funding deficit of £4 billion for county councils and unitary authorities over the years up to 2026. So, you know, it's a kind of increasingly difficult landscape. And it's not really about budgets, it's about people. It's cuts to essential services disproportionately impact the most vulnerable members of our society. And reduced funding means fewer resources for, you know, for education, for care, social welfare, social housing, basic services, and leaving the most marginalised amongst us to bear the brunt of those decisions. And again, you know, I've got responsibility for our climate action plan, and, you know, we've achieved a lot with that, but within within the kind of constraints that we have as a council, because without adequate funding, these aspirations are becoming increasingly closed, particularly in terms of decarbonising our social housing stock. So what should be the response? That's the question, I think, of the Green Party and the left in the face of all this. It's easy to give up the idea of getting Green councillors elected, you know, to add credibility to a broken system, as it were. But I think we need to see the current situation as an opportunity for tackling problems, if you like, on two fronts. First of all, and the frustrating bit, is we have to do the best we can for the communities that we serve, our residents and the most disadvantaged in our communities, you know, within all those constraints. But also, I think we need to see it as an opportunity to point out the brokenness of the system, the opportunities out there for true localism, local democracy, and locally delivered public services. And we need to make it clear that there is a better way. There's a better way to finance local government. And I could say a little bit more about that. And, you know, we perhaps might want to debate that, you know, in the discussion. A better way to bring direct democracy down to the people, to adopt a more deliberative form of democracy, and a better way in which we can value public services. So for the moment, and in a sense, that's all I've got to say, but I'm happy to kind of answer questions or come back, you know, in terms of the discussion. So I hope that that helps.
Thank you. Very well timed as well. Ria, would you like to speak now? And then we'll ask questions when each of our speakers have spoken. Thank you.
Yeah, I think a lot of what Steve's saying in terms of the background of poor financing of local government definitely applies in Croydon. So I guess I should introduce myself first. My name's Ria, and I'm a councillor in Croydon. I represent the town centre of Croydon, which is Fairfield Ward. I'm also the Qualities and Diversity spokesperson for the party. I sit on the campaigns committee, and I'm on the board of the DACA Fund, which is a fund set up to support global majority people getting elected internally in the party and externally in the outside and in local communities. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Croydon, but I wanted to speak a bit about Croydon's history and how that links to local government financing. So I was elected in May 22, which was kind of midway through this kind of situation from the bankruptcy, I guess. And so Croydon is under pressure in terms of inflation and the increasing demand for kind of social care and housing and welfare. And of course, the cuts are affecting many departments. So in November 2020, that was when Croydon Council's auditors issued their first report in the public interest. And this was kind of an investigation into senior kind of management performance and the kind of former chief executive and kind of what had happened, and looking at the reasons for the financial collapse and the decisions that were made. It was received in February 2021, but it wasn't kind of voted and to be published until February 2020. So there was a long period of time where we didn't kind of, I guess, the public didn't know what exactly was happening in terms of the financing of Croydon and the history and, I mean, financial history and issues that have happened in the past. So there's still this kind of historic kind of issues that affect the current financing of Croydon in terms of previous legacy budget corrections that are needing to be made. So, for example, in 2023, there was £49 million worth of legacy corrections made after the Mayor launched kind of this opening the books exercise to look into the previous financial decisions. I should probably explain that also we had previously had a committee kind of system in a council, and we also moved into May 2022 to a executive mayor kind of model of decision making, and the executive mayor has also kept all decision making power. And when the council became bankrupt, it was Labour who were in power at the time in the cabinet. Did I say committee earlier? I meant cabinet model. It's in May 2022, we had a Conservative mayor elected, and the makeup of the council was very split between Labour and Conservative. It was about half each. There's 2 Greens and one Lib Dem, and the 2 Greens and Lib Dem broke through in May 22. So going back, sorry, to the issues in the financing and the council's financial position, there's lots of historical issues that might still impact on future budgets, and but that seems to be going down in risk. In terms of this year's budget, from 24 to 25, there's still a kind of nearly £1 million kind of accounted for in terms of that. And then in terms of last year, we had the highest council tax increase in the country. It was 15% council tax increase. And we can, there was no referendum for that either. So people were really angry about the issue. Yeah, there was a lot of anger within local communities, understandably, about that increase of that big amount, without any kind of say in the matter. And lots of people were, obviously, local people weren't involved in the decision making that had happened, and poor decisions and poor contracts that had been entered into in Croydon. That also kind of links into the kind of chief executive and things being investigated by the police, and that kind of ongoing investigation. So the way that the council has then been servicing its debt and kind of balancing the books is through capitalisation directions from the national government. And so that means borrowing money from the government, but paying interest back. And so what you're doing is you're borrowing money and kind of almost digging yourself into a deeper hole of debt, because you've got that debt to pay back, but also you've got the interest on top of that debt to pay back to the national government. And where do you even get this money from to pay it back? And so last year, I think it was there was a capitalisation direction made for 23-24 last year for about 63 million. But there was also further ones made for previous years to restore the historic legacy kind of issues that were discovered. And then we're going to have to continue to borrow this money from the national government. And there's that cost to servicing that debt. And that's kind of, and the debt, the amount of debt that Croydon Council has is £1.6 billion worth of debt. So we're talking about like a massive kind of issue, because we're going to have to continue to borrow this money, and then it's the amount of money we're borrowing is also increasing year upon year by about £3 million. So this year we're due to borrow £72.5 million, which is up from last year's 60, what was that, what's that, 63. And so yeah, we're kind of just continuing to borrow and dig ourselves into a deep kind of debt. And then in terms of what I do in the council, so I represent the town centre, I sit on the licensing committee, but I also chair the Streets and Environment Scrutiny Subcommittee. And so within that, we look at all things to do with the built environment around us, planning, kind of parks, green spaces, climate, yeah, kind of building regulation enforcement, different things like that. And waste as well, contract. And so we've been looking at lots of the different issues, lots of the different projects that are happening within the council. And what we've kind of noticed is that in the past, it seems to have been really poor kind of contract that the council's got themselves into that has caused this kind of the original issue of the bankruptcy in the first place. And there's also the poor contract management that's still ongoing, and kind of there is a plan in place from the council to make sure there's kind of a transformation of that, and the procurement process as well. But yeah, there's that's one kind of issue in terms of the contracts. So Croydon's then got this renewal plan in place, and so there's lots of different transformations of the different services going on. We've also got in place the improvement insurance panel from the national government, and so they're specialists in certain areas that are in place. They don't have direct control over the council currently, but they're there to advise in an advisory capacity. And there's an exit plan in place to kind of have a smooth transition where they leave the council. So interestingly, last year in Croydon, Greens were calling for and wrote to Michael Gove to write off the debt and cancel the interest on that debt, and have kind of more fair funding for Croydon, because compared to other London boroughs, it's not it's
you
fair.
begin to wind up now, Rhea.
Yeah, and also, of course, better local government funding. And in this year's response from Croydon Council to the government's consultation on the local government finance settlement, they've written that Croydon does need a partial debt write-off. So they seem to be moving in a slight direction towards what we were saying. But yeah, that's currently where we're at, and just agreeing with what Steve said.
Yeah, and thank you, because we know that many of our councils are really struggling at this moment. So thank you for that real amount of information. Okay, can we hear from Rob now, please?
Right, thank you, Becky. Hi, everybody. My name's Rob Walker. I'm like Becky, down in Kent, the other end of Kent almost, in Faversham. But I've moved down here recently, end of last year, from Kirklees, which is an area really based around Huddersfield, up in West Yorkshire, smack between Manchester and Leeds in the Pennines. Up there, I was a councillor between 2016 and 2021. For 4.5 of those years, I was a Labour Party member, a left-wing Labour Party member. For the latter part of that, probably about 7-8 months, I left Labour in disgust, really, against about the attack on democracy and the abandoning of the policies which had been introduced under Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell, which for the first time I thought were beginning to address some of our real problems. I didn't stand again in 2021 because I knew I was moving down to Kent. If I had have done, I would have probably stood as either a Green or an independent. Before I became a councillor, I was the chair of Kirklees Environmental Partnership, which was an umbrella group of environmental groups, and I worked very closely with colleagues from the Green Party, and I maintained those links right through the period in which I was a councillor, which was quite interesting because at times there was quite a bit of friction between the ruling Labour group, which I was part of, and the 3 Green councillors in Kirklees. Within the council, I had various roles, but for the last 2.5 years, I was a cabinet member for environment and culture. Quite a big responsibility. It's a big council, 440,000 people. Interestingly, though, my environment role didn't include climate change, which at the time was quite a big thing, as Kirklees had declared a climate change emergency. And that basically, I think, was because the council leader felt I was too friendly with the Green Party members. And the role chairing this committee was given to another cabinet member who hadn't really got a massive interest in climate change, which was rather strange. My personal experience was very much echoing really what Steve and Ria have already said. It was about the increasing struggle to deliver services with declining budgets. I was looking after things like the waste contract, which was being renegotiated, things like dealing with potholes, things like the fact the local crematorium in Huddersfield had blown up and it needed a heck of a lot of money spending on it to get it back up and running again. And all those things were increasingly difficult because of lack of funding. And another massive problem, lack of staff. In things like the highways department, we were always at least 30% under the staffing levels that were needed to make things work properly. Impossible almost to recruit people when anybody with high-level skills were being offered substantially more to go and work in the private sector. Through this period, there was constant Tory and media attacks on the quality of services within Kirklees. All the time, it was looking to blame this on incompetent management within the council, wasting money, spending money on things like tackling climate change, tackling poverty, tackling inclusion, running courses on things like equal opportunity. So sort of economic thinking was linked in with the woke agenda to try and discredit the council. So that really, I think, reflects the experience of most people, whether you're a Green Party member or a Labour Party member on the left, in terms of the recent situation. What I do recognise is that since 2021, things have got a whole lot worse. The kind of problems that Steve and Ria are facing are significantly worse than those I faced before I left in 2021. What I want to try and concentrate on to broaden out the debate a little bit is, why is this happening? In a way, what we're doing is looking at the symptoms of the problem. But what is it that's leading to this kind of difficulty for local government? So, as Steve said, this is a long-term trend. You can date it back at least to the Thatcher governments. And it's linked, as well as economically reducing the funding for local governments, it's linked to attacks on local democracy as we're becoming an increasingly centralised polity where localism really is a joke. The Tory governments have come out with support for this, but in practice, that is not what's happened. I think to look at what's causing this, we've really got to look at international and national movements and forces. Really, a lot of this is about the economic and political ideas and power brokers who are really dominating the world economy and certainly the British economy. It's about value decisions. It's about decisions that are being made by people, often unaccountable politicians, that what is important are profits of big global companies, not the well-being of people and the well-being of the planet. It's camouflaged by a very simplistic view of the economy. Recently, last week, the week before, you saw Labour, you saw Rachel Reeves, you saw Keir Starmer going back to this idea about governments maxing on the credit card, the kind of thing that has been put forward since 2010 by successive Tory governments. It's really about making people feel that there's no alternative, that private sector is good, public sector is always bad and inefficient. Austerity is very much a political decision. It's about massively reducing public spending while shifting the blame from central government onto councils and other public bodies. So if you look at where the spending cuts have fallen, the biggest cuts have been very much around areas which are under the control of local government. And that's not an accident. It is politically very advantageous to the government because it enables them to blame councils, the kind of things that Ria's been describing, the problems in Croydon. It's easy for the government to say, oh, it's nothing to do with us. We're funding things really well. It's about incompetence and corruption, crazy decisions which are being made by people at local council level. The aim, I think, is to shift our economy along the lines of somewhere like Texas or Singapore. So we've got very low business taxes, a small state at both national and local level, very high levels of profit for large businesses, and a reverse Robin Hood kind of strategy where income and wealth is being redistributed from the poorer elements of society to the richer. And you only need to look at the figures for this, for Britain, what's happened over the last 13, 14 years. It is absolutely starkly clear that that has been a tremendously powerful trend, which has led many people in this country into dire poverty. But it's also led to massive problems wrecking really the fabric of our society, the kind of services and infrastructure that used to make Britain a good place to live are being destroyed. If we look at
wind up now.
Right, okay. So basically, I think this is a bigger problem. We need to think about what's causing that. I think the big questions are, sort of building on what Steve said, I take Steve's point that we've got to do the best we can as councillors in a very difficult situation. But we've also got to look at what can we do at local level, in national elections and outside Parliament and councils in terms of our campaigning, to think about how can we challenge the ideas and the forces that have led us into this situation. As Ria said, legally, we have to set budgets as councillors. If not, the power to do that and the power to run our authorities is taken from us. But if we just do that, what is the future? We're just going to see these things becoming worse and worse, local democracy just becoming even more of a joke, and the whole country just becoming more and more damaged. And I hope we can get into some of those things when we come on to the discussion stage.
Thank
Okay.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a lot that's been dealt with at the moment, and we do have some things in the chat as well. So I hope that our participants can bring those up as well. And finally, Chris.
Thanks, Becky. So firstly, just wanted to say a huge thank you to Green Left for organising this meeting. I think it's a particularly important time to be having this conversation in advance of the upcoming local elections, the next general election and so on, and to be having, I guess, the conversation about the future of local government financing from a radical socialist perspective, I think is important. And I'm sure that the discussion we have will be fruitful and useful for not least understanding and analysing the state we're currently in, but visioning how we get out of it, because that is the key. So way of introduction for those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Jarvis. I am leader of the Green Group on Oxford City Council, and for my sins, I'm our finance lead as well, and responsible for responding to the Labour administration's budget. I'm not actually going to talk a huge amount about Oxford now. What I wanted to do was try and pick up some of the threads that the other speakers have already started to unravel, and hopefully sort of carve a narrative of sort of my assessment as to, firstly, what's driving the financial mess that local government is in, and secondly, to hopefully start a bit of a conversation about what we need to do to get out of it. So I think for me, I was thinking about this meeting, what are the key things that have led to the situation where we've got, I think it's now more than a dozen, someone will correct me if I'm wrong, councils that have issued Section 114 notices. It looks like there's going to be quite a few more in the next 12 to 18 months, where, public services are being run down at a local level, left, right, and centre. And I think for me, there are 4 things that are key to this. The first of them is the obvious one, which is since 2010, since the coalition government was elected, the Tories first came to power in this century, we've had that massive programme of austerity. To put that in context, in the first decade of the Tory government, 2010 to 2020, central government funding for local government was cut by 60%. That's just in that first 10 years. That is astronomical, and no sector could possibly survive that kind of assault in one piece. Now, alongside that, what we've seen over the last few years is an increasing amount of what does exist of central government funding being in the form of pots of money that are tied to specific projects. This is in my view, deeply anti-democratic approach to local government financing. So what it means is that you have the government announcing a new pot of funding, which will, say, for example, fund traffic schemes or pothole repair or other projects. That pot is then divided up amongst a number of councils that are that submit successful bids, while others won't receive any funding at all. And what it means in practice is you have councils competing against each other for an ever-shrinking pool of resource for small chunks of cash that can only be spent on what are central government priorities. So you have a lower funding pot, and you also have priorities being set by central government. It also means that what we have now is a substantial amount of council officer time being spent writing funding bids. Now, I'm not sure that's a very effective use of council officer time, or taxpayers' money is having officers sitting down, writing extensive funding applications when they could be managing services, delivering services, and improving the lives of residents. That's the situation in terms of a brief overview of some of the issues around funding. Steve, in his introduction, outlined some of the restrictions we've seen on councils' revenue raising powers, which, the cuts directly from central government are one thing, but the cuts plus increased restrictions on councils' abilities to raise their own funds is a double whammy that has only exacerbated the problem. The biggest and most obvious one of these is the restrictions on council tax. So for those of you who don't know, I'm sure most of you do, councils are only able to raise council tax by a certain amount before triggering a referendum. Now, you'll notice that you probably have never voted in a council tax referendum. That's because almost no councils have ever gone for it to try and raise council tax at a higher amount. Why? Firstly, because running the referendum in itself is expensive. That's an additional cost the council will have to bear. Secondly, I don't think you would have to be a clairvoyant to know the likely outcome of a referendum on raising tax. And so councils aren't willing to take the risk of the additional costs of running the referendum, plus the likely outcome of that not generating any additional revenue. And there are also issues around the timing when the referendum would have to take place that put additional administrative costs on councils. So no councils, bar very, very few, have ever tried that. And what it means is that the council tax base is extremely low, and it is being squeezed. And basically what you then see is residents paying incrementally more council tax whilst getting less and less and less back from their local authorities because the central government's being squeezed as well. So you're paying more in tax and you're getting less out of it. It's absolutely the worst case scenario, and councils are being hamstrung from doing anything about it. There are also a bunch of other areas where councils are restricted from raising revenue, but I haven't got much time. But that is the big ticket one that has concocted a particularly bleak scenario when combined with the central government cuts. Now, those are the kind of financial policies that have led us to this particular dire situation. But there are a couple of areas of, I guess, other policy issues and societal changes that I think are worth really talking about in this context, because they are driving a lot of the particularly bad situations we've seen cropping up over the last couple of years. So you'll have noticed that the Section 114 notices that councils going bankrupt has increased quite rapidly in the last 18 months. That's partially because, you know, you've had year on year on year on cuts. It's partially because of some very specific issues within local councils that I don't know the details of. Ria has talked a little bit about some of them, but there are also some common policy areas that are really, really hammering councils. The first of these, I think it comes in two parts. It's firstly social care, which is talked about quite a lot. It's also children's services, are two areas which are causing councils to have massive problems. Now, I'm a district councillor. We don't have responsibility for social care or children's services, so I don't know a huge amount about this. But essentially, the picture is that a substantial part of the problem is coming from demographic changes. You know, in social care, why are councils under more pressure to provide more care? It's because we have an ageing population. That's the base level issue. The broader issue is that we've got that ageing population. We've not had a rise in funding to finance the increase in social care. And you've also got the absolute scam of privatisation of care services, where councils are largely now doing commissioning of care rather than provision of care, and money is leaking out into private providers when they are providing the care service. It's a very similar picture in children's services. So like in social care, you've got a massive expansion of demand. So in the last 10 years, there's been an increase from 68,000 to 83,000 children who are looked after essentially by the state in England. That's partially driven by essentially the state of the economy, increasing poverty, the cost of living crisis, and so on, has driven more referrals to children's services, which therefore means more people need looking after. But you also have alongside that essentially a parasitic private children's services sector, which is sucking huge amounts of money out of councils. So, for example, in 2023, there were 1,500 placements in England, which cost at least £10,000 a week. That's over £500,000 a year just to have a placement for one child, because it's in a private provider. The other policy area I want to talk about briefly is something which has emerged. I think something has emerged in the last 18 months, 2 years in particular, which is a crisis we've got in temporary accommodation.
Yeah.
So the crisis in temporary accommodation has seen that some district councils are spending as much as 50% of their budgets now on providing temporary accommodation for people who present as homeless. The idea that you could have a situation where local authorities are spending that proportion of their money on a single provision is astonishing. It's driven by a load of essentially government failings, where you've got. I'll wrap up at the end of this point, if that's all right, Becky, and then I'll touch on the solutions afterwards in this discussion. So it's driven by an increase in evictions from the private rented sector. You've got rents in urban areas in particular rising astronomically. The local housing allowance has been frozen. There's a lack of investment in social housing, which is compounded by the right to buy and some of the issues Steve mentioned. You've got some change in domestic abuse legislation, which are generally really, really good, but you've not had an increase in funding to deal with the increase in temporary accommodation need. You've got a lack of in-house provision for temporary accommodation in some councils, meaning they're having to use unsuitable alternatives like putting people up in hotels. And you've got government migration policy and the Home Office approach to asylum, which essentially, when asylum seekers get their claims processed, they get refugee status, they then instantly have to present as homeless, and then they're taking up more temporary accommodation. So I wanted to mention those two areas in particular, children's services and care and temporary accommodation, because I think it's important to understand that local government finances isn't just a picture of cuts. It's not just a picture of not being able to raise revenue, but the wider policy area that the central government sets has a massive ramification, and we're not going to solve the issue without solving those things as well. And I've got some thoughts on those, but I'll leave those for the discussion.
Thank you. And thank you, all of our speakers for the wide breadth of the work that we need. Chris, you just mentioned about the issue of homelessness. Here where I am in Dover, we have one of the highest areas of what they call houses of multiple occupancy, so that the housing stock that once was council houses have now been sold off, and the housing stock that is available is then sectioned off to alarming rates in pockets around the town, and particularly where I live, which has always been a poorer area of the town. We all know these issues, and that's why people recognise and respect us as being activists. But we need to bring that to the fore for making those changes. Can I open the discussion now, so that if you have your hands up, people indicate? I've got Charlie up first of all. Is that okay, Charlie?
Yeah, hi. Thanks for having this meeting. I'm actually, just to introduce myself, I'm from a grassroots campaign called the Campaign for Real Care, and we are a group of service users, disabled people who are kind of shut out of service use, and also carers, unpaid carers, and retired professionals. So yeah, we're a kind of mixed bag of people. And I just wanted to say this was a really useful meeting and really good to hear from all these different perspectives. But I'm here with the kind of social care hat on, as it were. And I'm really interested in what Chris was just talking about, and also what one of the things Robert touched on. And that's in regards to really looking at some of the solutions around dealing with kind of austerity cuts, dealing with, managing existing budgets. So obviously we know that councils have to balance budgets. They have to do that by law, and if they don't, then they end up in crisis. So one of the things that our campaign is looking at is why social care is in the state that it's in. It's one of the biggest, obviously the largest part of any local authority budget and spend, and neither the Tories nor the Labour Party are willing to address that. Then there have been cuts made at local level, but one of the biggest issues that's not being addressed is the fact that councils have a huge amount of responsibility for that, and they do tend to, particularly Labour, tend to blame austerity cuts on the mess of social care. Now we all know that austerity is terrible. None of us want austerity, but the reality is that local authorities, when it comes to social care, are not actually adhering to the Care Act, and they're not actually admitting that there's unmet need. So essentially, the policy behaviour that's coming from local councils, and this is across England, is actually creating a lot of the problem. And that's one of the things that our campaign is desperate to find a way for that to be put forward, because at the moment, the Conservatives aren't even remotely interested, obviously. The Labour Party won't touch us at the moment because we're too lefty. But then some of the left are like, don't want to know, because we won't just talk about austerity. Actually, what we're trying to talk about is policy. And so that's why I think what Chris is talking about is that the policy is what's really important. And I don't want to take up loads of time commenting, but I'd be really interested if any of you would like to speak to our campaign, because we've got some policy ideas, and we are grassroots, and we really think that that could have a massive impact. And if Greens could take this on as a policy, that could be really amazing. So that's what I wanted to say, and thank you so much for sharing. I'll put our contacts in the chat.
Yes, thank you for that. Roy will speak next, but I would like to say too is that I'm the Equalities Officer for the Kent branch of Unite Community, and this is something that we really work very hard upon, and putting that into the national framework is very difficult to do. It's also the case that there are a large number of people who don't vote, so they fall out of the system because politicians don't want to take up something that's going to be difficult for them to do. But we do have good policy within the Green Party, and I hope you will be able to engage with us. Roy, would you like to come in now?
Yeah, thank you. I want to raise a couple of points. A couple number of years ago, there was real discussions with the councillors in Brighton about red lines and no cuts budgets. Obviously, I personally was hopeful that was going to develop, and that Corbyn's Labour might have started to build some kind of campaign on a no cuts position, and obviously Greens and just one council can't fight it on their own, but Greens would have been involved with that. The other thing, so I'm interested in some of the ideas and solutions that will come out. The other issue is council tax. 3.3. I was a big anti-poll tax campaigner, did all the courts and stuff. So I've always been interested in council tax and the impact of non-payment if people can't afford. And the reality is that 3.3 million people have had liability orders. And we have seen a situation where councils pay large amounts of money to use bailiffs to collect debts. Clearly, even the Tories recognise at the moment people are really skint. Even worse, they're really suffering. I understand Hammersmith and Fulham, a council in London, has a policy of not using bailiffs, and they've seen their collections of council tax actually go up. And I'm interested in what the views of the Green councillors are on that, because I think we can't go along with the issue of using bailiffs. We have to address the issue of people having their stuff stolen out of their houses and all the trauma that happens. See, if you don't pay that's one point. If you don't pay one instalment of council tax, you will receive a threatening letter, and that just isn't on, is it? That's not on now, and it wasn't on in the past. It's especially not on now because we know what the debt is like. Thank you.
Yeah. And of course, too, being a poll tax campaigner myself, one of the things that we understood straight after that is the number of people that then disappeared from the electoral register, and that those figures are changing. Can I come back to our speakers, please, if there's something that you'd like to speak on from the comments that have been made from our two guests? Ria, would you like to start?
Yeah, I mean, on the campaign for real social care, I think that's really awesome. I didn't know about it's campaign for real care. Yeah, I didn't know about you, so I've just followed you. But yeah, happy to have a chat and link you in with the people who are writing the manifesto. I think there might still be a little bit of time left, but
great, thanks.
And yeah, I think social care is such an important thing to be financing, because in Croydon I know I keep speaking from a Croydon's perspective, but I think it's relevant because we're being asked from the improvement insurance panel that's in place, but also to continue cutting the budgets and kind of squeezing them as much as possible, and they've recognised that Croydon actually is one of the biggest spenders in terms of social care in London, and that might possibly be because we're the most populous borough in London, but also we had a failing service before, and they put a bit of transformation money into it to make it better, but kind of now they're wanting to cut it back again, and so, you know, almost suspecting for the service to kind of be struggling again in a few years' time once you're cutting and taking away money. Yeah, that's kind of my comments.
Okay. Steve, would you like to say something?
Yeah, I mean, again, Charlie, I'm really interested in the campaign for ill care. It looks, again, I've just had a quick glance at the website, and it looks fascinating. And even though at you know, district council level are not responsible for care, I think it's a really important campaign. But I did want to just pick up Roy's point in relation to you know, in relation to council tax and council tax defaults, and I completely agree with the point that he makes about bailiffs, and you wouldn't believe the punitive nature of the collection regime when you know, when the Tories lost control, and you know, the coalition that we've got in Waverley took over in 2019. I mean, absolutely unbelievable lack of humanity and care for, you know, some of the most vulnerable people. But you know, Roy mentioned the poll tax, and of course, like I guess a lot of people here, you know, I was on the marches and campaigning against the poll tax, you know, in those dreadful days when, you know, it was seen as being totally and utterly regressive as a tax. I mean, horrendous. But it was replaced by council tax and the current council tax system. And, you know, that looks progressive by comparison, but it's still not really a progressive tax. I mean, for example, in Waverley, I mean, typically Band A are paying about £1,500, you know, as a tax, and that's on, you know, like a kind of, you know, 1-bedroom studio or studio apartment, you know, will be paying a sort of Band A tax. Band H, which, you know, is a you know, substantial size detached house, would be, you know, paying about 4,500. In other words, it's like a 1-to-3 ratio. But of course, you know, there's no Band I, J, K, L, M, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T, U. In other words, you know, Band H has got, you know, no ceiling. So there are absolutely massive homes, you know, worth millions, that where the council tax payers are paying just 3 times as much as people struggling to pay Band A tax. You know, so it is an absolute nonsense, and it's a system that actually needs radical reform. One of the things, again, we're very constrained because you can't do anything about it. We can't create our own I, J, K, and L, and M, and O, P, Q, R, S, T, U, V, W, X, Y, Z in Waverley or anywhere else. We don't have those legal powers. But what we are proposing to do in Waverley is actually to set up our own support fund for some of the most vulnerable in our community, and actually suggest to our Band H payers that if their house is, you know, is worth well into the band or well above the band, that they could possibly donate to this fund. It's not the way I would like to operate as a council, but given the constraints that we're under, it's going back to what I was saying earlier, it's something that potentially we can do, which has been tried, has been used in a number of authorities, which actually I think might help and alleviate the situation. But as I think Chris was saying very clearly, you know, that's actually kind of, you know, tackling some of the symptoms, you know, but it's not actually tackling the major problem, which is a complete and utter reform of local government finance and of the way in which we value local government in this country.
Rob.
Yeah, I'd responded on the chat to Charlie about whether or not they'd been looking at alternative delivery models in terms of not-for-profit social care provision. I think there's a massive issue that the provision that was offered by local authorities going back 20, 30 years ago has been absolutely decimated. And it's been replaced by profit-making private companies, often providing very low standard of services. But I gather from Charlie, a lot of what she's looking at is quite different, really, in terms of the assessment of people. I don't know if Charlie wants to come back on that in terms of the kind of problems that she's dealing with.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Privatisation and the increase of private money going into social care is a huge issue. But I think the way that our campaign is working is that we're we're basically attempting to create a roadmap for a journey towards what we all want to see in social care, which is essentially an equivalent of the NHS, free at the point of need, fully publicly funded, and very much in line with Green Party policy. But the way things are at the moment is that there's very little talk about how that can look in practice in terms of policy. People aren't looking at policy. There's a lot of kind of rhetoric, and particularly from the Labour Party, we're getting all this rhetoric from Wes Streeting and co, talking about, oh, we've got this 10-year roadmap and all this. They're actually not talking about the real issues, and they're using, I'm going to say this in this meeting, using disabled people as a front, wheeling people out quite literally to kind of be the face of the this stuff. And actually it's they're not addressing the problem, and there is no alternative from what the Tories are offering. So I think in terms of in terms of what the Greens can offer for disabled and older people is actually something that could be a kind of real roadmap and we think that we've kind of, through all of our research and through all of the work that we've done as a grassroots group, and communicating with a lot of people nationally, because it's a national issue, that actually what could happen is that local authorities, local councils could put through policy at a local level that is different and that creates a kind of model for national change, rather than this kind of top-down approach where it's all very heavily gate-kept. And I mean, I could talk for hours about this, and I've just actually asked, I wonder whether it might be useful for us to come and maybe present to you guys, to the group, if people would be interested to hear about our campaign. I don't want to kind of take this meeting over.
No, Roy has just pointed out that we have had meetings and social care speakers in the past, so this is a recurring thing that I'm sure we'll have a great deal more discussion. Chris, would you like to say something now?
Yeah, I can jump in on a few of those points, and I'll try and pick on all of them actually. So starting with Roy's question around council tax and not using bailiffs, that's really interesting. I wasn't aware that I think you said Fulham, was it, that had passed policy saying they wouldn't use bailiffs for the collection of council tax. That's a very good suggestion, and I'm happy to look at what we can do locally, and also whether we can, it might be the sort of thing that we can escalate through AGC, the Association of Green Councillors, and see if we can get that as a norm everywhere, because yes, you're right, it's appalling that councils are doing that. when I many years ago, I had a series of scary looking letters in red ink, which ultimately had the word bailiff on it, and it was not a pleasant experience. Definitely not the way that council should be treating their residents. On your other point, Roy, I guess I don't think anyone's picked this up yet, around the question of no cuts budgets. This is a really interesting one, I think. And if you'd have asked me 14 years ago, 13, 14 years ago, as the sort of first wave of austerity came in, my view at the time was largely council shouldn't accept these cuts. They should stand up, get together, and essentially go to war with central government, saying no cuts budgets, and something reminiscent of the mid 1980s rate cap and rebellion, etc., war with central government, but win this time. I think my position on that is largely in some ways the same. That's one political strategy the left could use, but I'm also looking at the situation we have in local government at the moment, and in order for that strategy to work, you would have to have dozens of councils willing to do that, and therefore hundreds of councillors willing to take the personal and political risk of doing so. And I just don't think we're in that situation, anywhere close to it. And so what you'd likely end up with is if essentially one or two councils were to decide to go down that route, is they would be absolutely smashed, to be shown an example of, and you would have the worst forms of austerity imposed by central government, far worse than the way that the Tories treated Liverpool in the 80s, because they would not want that war on their hands. So my view is essentially it was a strategy that the left could have taken in 2010, 2011, if we were in any position to do so. The reality was that there was very little in the way of left-wing councillors across the country then. The Labour Party had been hollowed out of the left, and the Green Party hadn't started to win seats on any kind of mass scale. Where that might be a controversial view in a Green Left meeting, having been, veterans of the Brighton budget rows in the early 2010s, but we can pick that up. On the care question, it would be. I'd love to hear more, Charlie. I'm not a councillor that's responsible for social care, but I think it's a really, really. I'd love to hear more about the campaign. I think, the more the Green Party can learn from campaign groups like yours, the better. I just have a couple of things I wanted to say more broadly on the financial impact of social care on councils, which I understand is not the big issue, because the big issue is delivering good social care for the recipients. But I guess from my perspective, I guess there's a few other things I wanted to flag as, we've talked a little bit about, building a national care service that has parity with the NHS, that's properly funded, free at the point of use and so on, which is key. And that's, really important. But I think it's also important to see the social care thing in not in isolation from wider political and economic policy. So in order to deliver a financially viable social care model, we also need to look properly at full restoration of NHS funding that we've had since 2010, and also slightly before that, because the two systems are intricately linked. We also need to have proper mass investment in public health, often delivered at the local authority level, but also at other state bodies, because that's where a lot of the prevention can happen that can alleviate some of the burden on social care, where some of the active, proactive, preventative healthcare can take place on things like, obvious things like smoking cessation, all that sort of thing, which is needed in order to reduce the amount of people that require social care, particularly from a younger age. And I'm just looking at my notes. And obviously the NHS, part of the NHS's biggest problem is outsourcing and privatisation, and you won't solve the NHS crisis nor the social care crisis without dealing with those either. But I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Chris. Going through the chat, Pete has put up mentions about the Green Disability Group and Green Seniors, who have done quite a bit of work with that, and as special interest groups that we in Green Left work alongside of. Some of our members are part of those groups as well. It's something that I think we can at least sort of like work at the sort of policy forward spaces that as Chris pointed out, we could then offer to our Green councillors, because one of the things about Greens across the country is that we are primarily activists, and therefore we have, as it were, that local knowledge that will support the sort of policies that people need and that they will go forward on. I don't want me to be waffling as much. Is there any more questions, please, from amongst our audience? Okay. Well, then now, the things that have been asked, and thank you, because we've covered a very broad range of work that I think will generate a lot more discussion, both within the Green Party, but also amongst the other friends that we have who think like we do as eco-socialists. And so it helps us going forward for the sort of discussions that we're going to take forward. Can I now ask our four panelists to follow up in terms of what they would like to say, and maybe take 5 minutes each, so that if there is any other questions that come up. Pete, is there something that you think I may have missed out, because you know I'm not very good at reading? He's not saying anything. Pete, where are you?
I'm here, and you're all right, Becky. Go ahead.
Yes. Okay. Can we start with Robert this time?
Yeah, just really briefly, I think it's been a very good discussion, and I think it's highlighted the fact that local services, local councils are massively under threat, and this is having a very real negative impact on many people in this country. And I think we do need to have more discussions about different aspects of this and what we can do as left and green activists in terms of trying to tackle some of these problems. As Chris pointed out, setting a deficit budget and so on, it's just so difficult given the legal framework in terms of what happens if councillors go down that route. But there must be ways that we fight back, because I think if we get a Labour government, they're not going to be a lot better. I think people like West Streeting are equally as bad as some of the awful people that we've currently got in power. So I'm very worried really about the future. And I think we do need to start doing something about it. Yeah, that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Ria?
Yeah, definitely. I think we need to see a massive radical change in how local government is funded, to be honest. I don't think we're going to get that with Labour. So we do need to come up with a plan for how Greens want to kind of would change that, basically, and invest in our services and local communities. I do think there's also a kind of role with the Green Party, maybe the AGC, to play in terms of supporting councillors who maybe are going through or are a part of members of councils that are going through bankruptcies, and kind of supporting understanding kind of some of the terminology and kind of things that could happen, and kind of things that Greens would be advocating for, like in a practical sense. Because yeah, it was interesting trying to navigate that in Croydon, but this kind of issue is likely going to become more and more across in terms of other boroughs and local authorities and councils, as you know, if we continue to cut the funding that's available. And I think the point that Chris raised as well, actually, in terms of the pots of money and the councils have to apply for, and the amount of time that takes up in terms of writing, and then kind of only certain authorities getting the funding, and it being so restricted as well, is a massive part of this issue. And I'll leave it there. But thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Steve.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I don't want to be too long. I mean, I think it's been an excellent discussion, and you know, there's been some really interesting points that have been made. I've learned a great deal, and you know, particularly kind of I've made you know, I've bookmarked Campaign for Real Care and Compassion in Politics, which I didn't know anything about before meeting this evening, which you know, which I think are really doing an amazing amazing job, and you know, absolutely the right kind of thing that we need. You know, there's a lot of points being made. Again, Ria just picked up the point that that Chris made earlier on about the bidding culture in local authorities. Complete and utter waste of time. You know, it's this prospect. I mean, we all have to do it, and we've actually benefited by it because we've invested in officers to do that, to actually tackle our climate emergency. But it seems utterly bizarre that actually what accesses funds, for example, to deal with a climate emergency in a council is not a well-constructed and well-sourced action plan in terms of what we need to do, which is then funded by government. It's actually this kind of randomized, you know, bidding for pots of money, you know, from the decarbonisation fund and so on. It's absolutely ludicrous, but you know, it's a game that we're in, which kind of brings me on to the point that that Chris made, you know, about concerted action and direct action, and again, you know, particularly when austerity was beginning to bite. Of course, the Labour Party at that time wasn't in the position that briefly it became, which was a kind of organization to fight back those kind of attacks, if you like, which it was to some extent under Jeremy Corbyn. And it's of course swung now completely back to being a very feeble and, you know, watered down kind of organization, and certainly one that, you know, can't really claim to be socialist anymore, sadly. But you know, I do think that, you know, we do need to be thinking about sort of what concerted action we can take, because you can have movements of councils. I mean, the declaration of the declaration of a climate emergency was a movement which was actually started, you know, in Bristol, and it spread across councils throughout the country, and that was, you know, that's become an amazing force to bring, you know, the issue of climate change and the urgency of it, you know, to people across the country. So, you know, you can have concerted action, and you know, if the mood is right and the time is right, that can turn into direct action. But I completely agree with Chris that actually, you know, what you don't want is something that goes off, you know, very, you know, as, you know, very feebly, if you like, and just all it does is just create one or two martyrs for a cause and a terrible backlash. So but I do think we need to be looking at ways in which councils can work together, because as I said, I think right at the outset, the situation and sadly the situation under a Labour government is not going to get better, and if anything, it is probably likely to get worse.
Yes. And Chris, I think it is Chris, isn't it? Hasn't spoken.
Yeah. Thanks, Becky, and yeah, thank you to everyone for joining this evening and for the questions, and as I said at the beginning, for Green Left for putting this meeting on. I think it's been really, really useful and interesting. I've learned a lot, and I think there's lots we can take from it. When we're sitting around talking about local government finances, it can often get to the point where, you know, the misery descends and the bleakness and the depression seeps into your every pore, because the truth is that the situation is incredibly, incredibly bleak. And I guess, given I've got the last word, I wanted to talk a little bit, I guess, about what our vision of local government as Greens is, and how things could be different, and the kind of the world and the local government setup that we're sort of striving for. And I think, you know, I was elected as a councillor when I was 27, I think now, not too long ago. But you know, a lot of people my age and a lot of my friends were utterly baffled by the idea that I was standing to be a councillor. You know, local government isn't the sexiest sounding thing in the world. Being a councillor isn't the most exciting thing. You know, sitting in licensing committees until 9 p.m. isn't the way that most people want to spend their 20s. And it has a bad reputation of being relatively dull, about administering and essentially administering decline. And that's how it has sort of been for the last 14, 15 years. And those of you who've been around longer may say it's been like that for 40 years, since Thatcher or whatever. But I think we need to stay clear as to what our vision of local government is, which is very, very different, because local government can, at its best, and should be utterly transformative. There is no reason why in this country we can't have a mechanism of local government which delivers world-class public services, which improves people's lives day in, day out, which means that they can get a decent house for a decent rent, which means that, you know, they're protected against the ill health, against everything else. And I think we have to stick to that vision, because that's the vision that we have, and that's the vision we need to build towards and organise. And yes, when we're in local council chambers, it's very, very difficult to cling on to that vision, and it's difficult to deliver that vision because of the constraints and the bleak situation we're in. But I think we have to keep that in mind, and we have to keep striving for it, and we have to keep having meetings and discussions like this about ways that we can transform local government to be like that. You know, the things that I've learned today, you know, I want to go away probably this evening and look at whether Oxford City Council is using bailiffs in its council tax enforcement, and if it is, stopping that from happening. And that will be an improvement to, you know, some of the worst off residents in our city's lives. That's the sort of thing that we need to be thinking about, what we can do day to day to, you know, use to use what little powers we have to improve people's lives, to protect the planet, and so on, and then keep striving for the national change, the changes in legislation, the changes in financing, and so on, that we need to deliver, both through, you know, organising within the Green Party, organising through other spaces and movements, building campaigns that can secure that, because local government can and should be transformative, and I am not willing to give up on that, and I think that we can win it. We just need to find the strategy, the drive, the people, and we will win eventually. So hopefully I can leave you on a slightly more positive note than most meetings on local government finances do. Thanks for having me, and thanks to Green Left for organising.
And right, now you've got to put up with me now for 5 minutes, if that. It's interesting, Rob has just said that he was interested to meet Greens in Kent, who are members of Friends of the Earth. And my help, as it were, after became a Green councillor in 2019, it's because I went to Paris. I was close enough to go to Paris for the COP21 in 2016. And that gave me a real understanding of how things are done in different areas. And sometimes it's very difficult for us, because we are, as councillors, we are constrained by the way that things are done in the UK for politics, but we can learn from each other, and sharing that opportunity is the thing that we need. being an activist for most of my life before I even thought, no, I don't really want to be a member of a political party before I joined the Greens. My route into joining the Greens was because I was down the docks screaming ban live exports for ages, and then I met some Greens that were in Ashford, and they introduced me to Greens for Animal Protection and showed me some of the policies, and I spent 2 years before I thought to myself, yes, I will join this party. Now we are having a resurgence of people who know what we do, but don't always know about how our policies can transform their lives. And that's one of the reasons why we need to work really hard at getting more Greens in the room. That was the first thing that was said. Having Greens on our councils means that we can do the difficult things, the different things that make a difference to people's lives. So our experience goes back a long way, and our community issues is what makes us stronger. Now, I'm just checking through if there's anybody else within our group who has a burning thing that they'd like to say, other than thank you, everybody. Thank you for our councillors for giving us a really lively and broad-ranging set of things to think about. And watch this space, because we've got a lot more to go, I'm sure.
Pete's got his hand up.
Pete?
Yeah, I've got to make sure I've got the mic. Yes, I've got the mic in front of my face, which I sometimes forget. Yeah, I'd like to just thank Beccy for chairing, and for all the speakers and everybody who's participated in the meeting. I think it's one of the best open meetings that Green Left has hosted, and I'm glad we recorded it, because it gives people more opportunity to see it. But I intend to take forward the proposal for a meeting with the campaign for real care, maybe not just with Green Left, but with some of the other Green Party groups who would have an interest in that, including the Association of Green Councillors. So hopefully I'll be able to make a proposal for organising such a meeting in the future. The other last thing is just a quick plug. The next Green Left Open meeting will be on, I don't know if it's a more or less contentious subject, but it's going to be in about a month's time. We haven't fixed the date yet or organised the speakers, but it will be about migration, population and climate change. So that's something maybe to look forward to. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, and well done.
Right.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.